This is Ilm Circle, a learning workshop presented by the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, or ISBA. Ilm stands for Intentional Learning for Mutual Respect, the foundation of what ISBA is all about.
Welcome to the August Ilm Circle. We haven't been together in a couple of months, summer travels and all for everybody. So I hope you all had a good summer. Great to see all of you again, and welcome back to the August Ilm Circle, which is Understanding Muslim Scholar Titles. And we have a wonderful speaker with us tonight. I've been just kind of chatting a little bit in the background while you all were in the waiting room with Ustad Yusuf Shah Massoud. And he will be presenting to us so that we can kind of learn some new things tonight with regard to scholarly titles. Ustad Massoud is a dedicated community builder and advocate of faith-based education and financial empowerment. He serves as the Director of Development for ACA, Arizona's premier K-12 Islamic school, and manages the Greater Arizona Muslim Scholarship Fund, the nation's largest scholarship provider for Muslim students, which has distributed over $5 million since its inception. So exceptionally impressive. A graduate of Zaytuna College, the first Muslim liberal arts college in America, Ustad Massoud has spent over a decade studying the Islamic sciences under the leading scholars from the San Francisco Bay Area and beyond. He's a certified personal finance coach and the founder of MuslimFinance.com, dedicated to building wealth and increasing faith-based financial literacy in the Muslim community. Beyond his professional work, which is highly esteemed, he remains active with MOVE, with MAS and many other local organizations, and the Valley Masjid. So we are so pleased to welcome Ustad Massoud tonight. And I love the topic of financial literacy, so I'm hoping I can use a good portion of this with my students too. So we are going to take questions kind of throughout. If you feel more comfortable putting questions in the chat, please do that. If you want to unmute, just raise your hand and we'll take questions that way. But since we have an intimate group tonight, we can keep it a little bit kind of organic, to use that term. So welcome and thank you so much.
Hello, assalamu alaikum, peace and greetings be upon you all. Thank you for taking the time to be here. I hope to have an edifying time with you. I'm so grateful to ISBA, the Islamic Speakers Bureau, Auntie Azra, Sister Michelle, everyone who's helped put this together. I remember about 20 years ago attending a Speakers Bureau training when I was a much younger person that Auntie Azra taught. And so, you know, I really owe a lot to her. I've never mentioned that to her, but I do owe a lot to her and where I am now. This topic is one that I'm really excited to present about. I hope it's edifying. I hope it's beneficial. I'm happy to make it very technical. I'm happy to keep it as simple as needed. So please feel free to chime in as we go. But I hope this is beneficial. Before we begin, I just want to mention that today is actually a very special day for Muslims across the world. Many scholars consider this day, the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal, to be the day in which our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born. And so Muslims across the world are kind of celebrating his birth. And I just want to acknowledge for us how significant that is, right? We consider him to be a prophet after all these great prophets and messengers continuing in their tradition. And we consider him to be a great blessing on the world. And so I want to mention that. And the reason I want to mention that is because our Prophet taught us that the ulama, the scholars, as we'll speak about this term, are the inheritors or the heirs of the prophets. And so I've had the tremendous privilege to be able to sit and benefit from dozens of great people of God, of great scholars. And, you know, for us, it's not just a simple student-teacher relationship. They're really people who we serve, that we sit with, that we travel to learn from, we travel with. And so we consider them the inheritors of the prophets, but they wouldn't be who they are. Muslims wouldn't be who we are if it wasn't for the prophets in the first place. So really, really grateful for the existence of our prophet and his birth. And today is a day that we celebrate that. So if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see this. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So on one hand, apologize. I was really excited about this topic, and the research took a lot more time than I expected. And so I wanted to make a proper presentation, but it's more of a document. I'm actually planning to work on this further. And I hope, I don't mean to toot my own horn, but I actually haven't found a treatment like this anywhere. I've seen some basic treatments of a few terms here and there, but, in all my time studying for the past 10, 12 years, I haven't found one place where you can actually find all of these titles and their meanings and so on in a text. Really, it's been through reading multiple books and just studying that I've come across this. And I think this is the first time that maybe someone is putting these together. And so I was really excited about the topic and really excited about this project. And I'm looking forward to share this further, develop more material and content around it. But basically, what I want to do is I want to refer or teach, certain terms that are used commonly in Muslim contexts, so that people are familiar with these terms and when to use them. And to be honest, you'd be surprised, but even most Muslims don't know how to use these terms properly. Many of them are improperly using them all the time, and it irks me sometimes. So I think this would be beneficial to really anyone, whether one is a Muslim or someone of another faith. So I want to basically cover some of the common terms that are used, and then we'll get into some more niche terms that are specific to certain fields and subjects. And so feel free to ask questions as you'd like. We don't have to get through all of them. That's fine as well. But I hope it'll be beneficial regardless. So specifically, we're going to look at terms that are used as titles of reverence to refer to certain scholars who specialize in certain fields, and terms that are just used more generally as well. The first one and the most common one that people are familiar with is usually imam. So imam, it literally comes from the Arabic amam, which means in front of, right? Because the imam is someone who leads prayers. And so the basic meaning of imam, you'll find there are different meanings for this one term, and we'll cover some of them. But the most basic meaning is someone who leads the congregational prayer. As Muslims, we tend to like to pray together. We have 5 daily prayers. And so the imam is the person who leads the prayers. But in a wider context, it can also mean someone who is the leader of a mosque community or someone who's just respected in the community. So in this context, it's similar to a pastor or a minister that you'd find at a church, for example. So imam is usually the most common term. But the other thing about the Islamic scholarly tradition is that we don't actually have unlike in the Catholic tradition, for example, like an ecclesiastical authority. We don't have a clerical hierarchy. There are some Muslim groups, we'll discuss the other strand of Islam, the Shia. They have a bit of that. But for Muslim scholars, it's really, all these terms that we'll talk about, they're usually not something that you get once you graduate from a degree or some higher authority is giving it to people. It's usually a term that, someone will just recognize, or a group of people will recognize that you've become esteemed in a certain field or a discipline, or you've made a certain accomplishment. And then it's usually the consensus of people around them that'll use that term, right? So that's why you'll find really for this term imam, for example, yes, it can refer to the leader of a mosque, but it can also refer to anyone who leads prayers, right? So even my son, within a few years, he'll be ready to lead prayers. He can lead prayer, and technically he would be the imam in that capacity, if that makes sense. Any questions about this? I'm going to slow down for these first few because they're usually the most referred to or the most important terms. All right. The next term that is often used is the term sheikh, which refers to, really, originally it means an elder, right? Someone who's older, someone who's wiser, who's more experienced, who's more educated. But it's often the term that people use before someone's name to refer to scholar. This sometimes bothers me because sometimes you'll have a graduate who's 20, 25 years old of a seminary, hasn't had those life experiences, that wisdom from decades of studying, and they'll be called sheikh. I actually sometimes become uncomfortable if people call me sheikh. It happens often, but I consider someone who hasn't studied for multiple decades to really not really be at that level. So I accept it graciously, but the word sheikh is something that many imams or scholars, we'll call them Sheikh Hamza, Sheikh Yusuf, Sheikh, whatever their name is. We'll use the word Sheikh before it, but it doesn't have a technical meaning. It's used in different contexts. And in a tribal setting, it was also the chief, right? The tribal chief would be called a Sheikh as well. So a Sheikh is a common term as well. The female equivalent of that would be Sheikha. So there are female scholars who are very experienced. They could be called Sheikha, and there's a plural word for it as well. If you'll notice, I mentioned the female terms for a lot of these words. But if you'll notice, the word imam doesn't have a female equivalent because the role of imam is almost like an office, right? The office of someone who leads the prayer. And historically, in Muslim contexts, women don't lead prayers generally. It's usually men who lead prayers, not because they can't be scholars. There are many women who are scholars, but it's a specific function that men play. It's an office that men take on, with rare exceptions, right? So there are different schools of Islamic law, and in one of those schools, women can lead other women in prayer. So I know some people who will do that, but usually it's men who lead women in prayer. It's interesting, in just a side note, in China, there are actually women's mosques. So there are mosques that are run by women that serve women only, but because they follow the school of law in which women don't lead prayers, they actually bring in a man to lead the actual prayer. But aside from that, the entire mosque is run by women, if that makes sense. So it's a very interesting. Islamic cultures are different, regional variances, legal differences, and so on. But technically and historically, the role of imam is something that is done by men, and that's why you don't find a female equivalent to that term. But when it comes to a lot of these other terms, these other roles, these other scholarly classifications, you'll find a female equivalent. If that makes sense. So these are the two most common terms, imam and sheikh. If there are no questions, feel free to interrupt me at any time. We'll continue. Another term that's very common as a title is ustad. And this is one that I actually want to promote people use, right? Instead of calling everyone sheikh, even when they might not be, have the experience or the maturity to have this term. Ustad is something that is used as a term. It really is the equivalent of a professor or a teacher or someone who teaches, has studied the religion and teaches the religion. There are other terms as well, muallim, mudarris. These also mean teachers, but usually don't use muallim or mudarris as titles. So you wouldn't say muallim Yusuf or mudarris Yusuf. You'd say ustad Yusuf or ustad Joseph or whatever the name is. But ustad is also interesting because it's not originally an Arabic word. It's a Persian word, and you see we'll see a lot of words that are Persian or Turkish or loan words, and so ustad is a word that came into Arabic from the Persian language, but is as a common term that I think more Muslims should learn to use and use for a lot of people who are teachers of the religion. And I think there's one or two more terms that are very common. This next term, Maulana, is a very common term as well. It translates to our patron or master, but it's really a title of reverence. So it's not that someone's literally a master in that sense, but it's a title that is used especially in South Asia. So if you go to the Indian subcontinent, a lot of people use this term. It is almost the equivalent of sheikh. So anytime someone's a elder, teacher, experienced scholar. Instead of sheikh in South Asia, they often use the word maulana, but it's a word that you'll find in the Turkish world, the Persianate world, even the Arab world. Usually in Arabic, it's specific, like very high dignitary. So they'll use the word sheikh most of the time. But if it's like a grand mufti, we'll talk about what a mufti is, or like an ambassador or dignitary, they might use the word maulana. But maulana is very common. So like my grandfather was a scholar in Bangladesh. They used to call him Maulana Yusuf. I'm named after him. So they wouldn't usually use the word sheikh. They use the word maulana. So usually sheikh and maulana are equivalent or interchangeable, but sheikh is more common in the Arab world, and maulana is more common in the South Asia, that region. That makes sense. And then we'll continue with two more terms. I think there's just two more terms that are fairly common. Another word that's an honorific title, and this is one that can be used very widely, is this word Hazrat. Hazrat it's a Persian word, but it actually comes from Arabic. So here you have the reverse. Ustad was from Persian and it came into Arabic. Hazrat is from Arabic and comes into Persian. Hadra is an Arabic word which means like presence or dignity. It's kind of almost like idiomatic. It's hard to explain it in English, but it really means, you're basically saying you're in the presence of someone great. And that's why it translates to presence. It's almost like his eminence. or someone who's esteemed. And it's a term that we can use widely. So, for example, a lot of times instead of just saying Prophet Abraham, we would say Hazrat Ibrahim or Abraham, Hazrat Yusuf, right? Hazrat Mary, Maryam, right? Mary, the mother of Christ. The family members of the prophet, right, female or male. So it's also a word that's used for men and women, and it can be used for companions of the prophet, great scholars, individuals that are esteemed. So it's a widely used word. And it's very flexible and fluid in its meaning. It's not super common in the Arab world. It's more common in the Persianate, Central Asia, South Asia. But it is a word that I like to use often, just as a form of respect, instead of just saying Muhammad, to say Hazrat Muhammad or whatever the name of a person is. The last term that I think is important to know, is commonly used, is this word alim. Alim is the word ilm, right? Knowledge, which is the name of the ilm circle, right? We call this ilm circle. So ilm means study or learning, right? Knowledge. It's a word for knowledge. So alim is a person who studies, right? A person who knows, or it's the technical term for a scholar. And so the female equivalent of this is alima, and the plural is ulama. So sometimes you'll actually hear the word ulama more than alim. So when you say scholars, people usually use the plural. If there's referring to a specific scholar, they might say imam or maulana or sheikh. They usually don't say alim Yusuf, right? They'll say sheikh or imam. But ulama is the word that's used to refer to the body of scholars, right? The entire group of scholars. And basically, an alim is someone who has gone through a process of rigorous study. They've studied in a traditional seminary setting, or they've studied one-on-one with teachers, but they've received these licenses, these chains of student to teacher chains that go all the way back to our Prophet, peace be upon him. So basically, through that process of studying a subject to the point where you get certified in that subject or authorized to teach that subject, that's how you become an alim, if that makes sense. So these are the, let's see, six terms that you'll kind of commonly find. And honestly, if you have these 6 terms, you're probably fine. These are probably the 6 that you really need to know in a general setting. A lot of the terms, the next few terms we'll look at, are less common or they're specialized. And then I'll go through specific fields or subjects and the terms that are used in those specific disciplines. If that makes sense. Any questions so far? Okay, wonderful. All right, so let's continue on to some more terms that are less common. They're not usually used as titles, but they're more like roles or offices. Occasionally, you'll find this as a title as well. And a lot of these are specific roles that you'll find in, for example, a mosque setting. So the first one we'll look at is the word khatib. And this is someone who is a preacher. Specifically in the context of giving sermons. So for Muslims, on Fridays, Friday is like our day of Sabbath, and we have our Jummah congregational prayer, and part of that is the Friday sermon. And so the person who gives that sermon is called a khatib, because the word for the sermon is khutbah, and so this word khutbah comes into the word khatib. We also have Eid prayers, so our annual celebrations twice a year, special days for us. There's also a sermon that takes place then. So khatib is someone who gives sermons regularly. Again, they don't have to be an imam. They don't have to be a scholar even. They could just be someone who's a good orator. But oftentimes, someone who is qualified. And very rarely this term is actually used by someone who's just a phenomenal public speaker. So there's a great scholar in the Islamic tradition. His name is Khatib al-Baghdadi. So the Khatib from Baghdad, right? Like the city of Baghdad. But he was given this title because he was such a powerful orator that he was just known throughout the world as someone who was really gave fiery sermons and so on. So Khatib is a term used for someone specifically who gives sermons on the pulpit at the mosque. Another word that's somewhat related, a mosque function, is the word muadhin. So the call to prayer that happens, Muslims pray 5 times a day. And so there are prayer times that come in. And at the beginning of the prayer time, the caller will go up on the minaret or the microphone, and they'll do the call to prayer. If you go to the Muslim world, you'll hear this all over, in the microphones. It basically is a way to alert people that it's prayer time. So the caller to prayer, the one who gives adhan, is called a muadhin. So it comes from the word muadhin, adhan. And basically that's the name for someone who calls to prayer. If that makes sense. Another term that I wish more Muslims utilized, right? This is a good word to use for a lot of people, is the word da'i. It's a harder word to say. It comes from the word da'wah. So da'wah is basically invitation or calling people to the faith. It's usually people who give inspirational talks, lectures, who invite both Muslims and non-Muslims to learn more about the religion, to practice the religion. It can involve interfaith dialogue, and so on. So this is a word that there are a lot of people, we live in the TikTok world. And so there are a lot of people who are giving, a lot of the messages are good, right? Inspirational messages, but they're not qualified scholars. They haven't gone through a course of study. They haven't been given permission or certification to teach, right? But a lot of people view them as scholars because they have big platforms. And so I would say that a lot of the people who have big followings on social media today, some of them are qualified, some of them are not. But this is a good term, calling someone a preacher, a da'i. Just because someone can speak well doesn't mean they're a scholar, doesn't mean that they're someone who is qualified to teach, but they might be very good speakers. They might have knowledge. They might be able to communicate effectively. So this is a good word, a preacher, a da'i. We don't have missionaries in Islam, like in a technical sense that you'll find in other religious practices, but it's akin to a missionary, someone who it might be a good storyteller and so on. That makes sense. All right, so we can continue. Now, these two terms I include not because they're very commonly used, but because they come up here and there, especially in the Western media, you hear them. One of them is the word Maulawi or Molvi. Molvi is the kind of South Asian equivalent of Maulawi. This is more in Persia, South Asia, that region of the world. This is something that it's less prestigious than Maulana, which is the equivalent of Sheikh, but it's someone who studied and maybe leads prayers, teaches in the community, that kind of thing. So someone who studied in a seminary or a madrasa, someone who's graduated from there. The other term that is similar, and all three of these terms come from the same root. So Maulana, Maulawi, Mullah. Mullah is a very common term in like Iran, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and it's not a very esteemed name. It has a neutral meaning. It's not necessarily negative, but it's someone who is like in a village, leads the prayers, right? Maybe studied in seminary for a few years, graduated, isn't a very highly esteemed scholar, but someone who can, help lead prayers. If a marriage is happening, if a birth is happening, they can, fulfill those roles. But this term has become very negative and is a pejorative in the Western media just because of geopolitical situations and such things that have happened. So the leader of the Taliban, he's referred to as Mullah Omar, and so a lot of the people, the Taliban, right, members, they were students of religious seminaries, very entry-level students. They just graduated. But because of that association with Taliban and the extremism that's associated with them, the word mullah is one that, is not commonly used in the Muslim world. If you go to North Africa, if you go to the Arab world, it's not commonly used, but it has become a stand-in for extremist religious clerics, basically, if that makes sense. So it has a fairly neutral meaning in the Muslim world, but it has a fairly negative meaning in the Western media, which is why I included it, just so that we're familiar with it. But it's not a word like in my, 30 years of, being in the community, I've never really heard someone called mullah here in the West, if that makes sense, or even when I was traveling in the Muslim world. It's very rare that it's used, but in certain places in the world, it would be commonly used. That makes sense. Any questions? I think that's the last of the general terms that we'll look at, and then I can go to some specific terms, specific fields. Okay. So I'll go. Yeah, go ahead.
Masood, are these titles selected by the individual, like this is what I prefer to be called, or are they assigned by the community, depending on what the person's background is, or how did the titles come to be associated with a particular individual?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. I think one thing is that it's very organic. I would say it's very organic. Unlike a top-down approach, right, where there's higher authority that's assigning these titles. That's not the case. But it's also out of humility, right? A scholar will not say, "Oh, I want you to call me this," right? I want to be referred to as this term. What really happens is a community will come together, or not even, it's not usually formal, but they'll recognize that this person is qualified, that this person serves a certain role, and they might bestow that term or utilize that term with that individual, and then other people will hear it, and slowly it'll be kind of disseminated like that. And oftentimes it's scholars will recognize other scholars. So, you sit down with someone who has studied and you can kind of get a sense of, they've studied these subjects, they've went to the school, they have this certification. And through that process, they kind of get these terms. And so most of these terms are not assigned from the bottom up or top down or from one individual or top down, but it's just very organic. And some of these terms are some of them are honorifics, right? Maulana, Sheikh, and so on. But some of them are functions of an office, right? Like you're the imam at the mosque, or you're the muaddin, you're the caller to prayer, or you're someone who gives sermons. And so that's how they kind of come to gain these titles, if that makes sense.
Sure. Thank you. And then I have one other kind of, and I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask the question anyway.
Sure.
So when you translate from Arabic or Persian into using the Roman alphabet, it's not, a smooth transition. And so some of the terms, like the spelling is different. Like I'm going to just start with the second one, Sheikh.
Yeah.
I've seen the spelling is different. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking that's part of colonialism too, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it's impossible to translate a language directly, and there's even different conventions of transliteration. So it actually gets kind of, as someone who's like very technical and academic and so on, I really like you'll notice here, Ustad, right? There's a long A vowel here, right? So I put an A line over it. You'll notice some other words that I'll look at later. I'll add a dot under like terms that aren't usually used because the English language doesn't have an ayin sound or a wa sound or different sounds. And so there is certain conventions to help translate, but Muslims are constantly translating, Shaykh could be spelled Shaikh, right? And then you'll actually have different contexts too, where in the Turkish language, they use different letters to refer to a term, right? So there is like a lot of variation there. But, I think colonialism plays a role, and I can talk about the harms of colonialism. But at the same time, even the Persian and the Turkish and the Roman and the Arabic, like you'll find differences. And to me, like they're all welcome, right? The language is a very fluid thing, and I'll look at some terms later that there's a Turkish and a Persian. They look very different, but technically they're the same word. So I think it could be open. I don't think anyone's going to be offended if it's not spelled a certain way or any of that. Makes sense.
Yeah, just trying to, be respectful and, even the word or the title for the individual that does the call to prayer, that's not the title that I'm familiar with. And so,
Sure.
again, trying to be respectful
Yeah.
and learn from this opportunity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It goes a long way. And again, you'd be surprised. I think most Muslims, this would be new to them, right? I think, I've taught for many years in the Muslim community, young people, older people, and, the terms I'm about to get to, most of them people are not familiar with, although some of them they should be to some extent, if that makes sense. Okay. I just want to do a time check. When do we want to wrap up by? I want to be respectful of.
We need to probably be finished by 7:30, and so we can, you can stop at say 7:20 if you want to, and we can do questions at that point, or we can continue to take questions.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we're not wrapping up by 7 or so, and I'm conscious of time. Okay, so now we're going to get into more terms or titles that are specific to certain fields, right? So there are different disciplines, theology, law, and so on. And so these are titles that scholars get in their specific respective field, if that makes sense. The first one we'll look at is Islamic law or jurisprudence, what is known in the Arabic language as fiqh. And this is specifically when it comes to the rules of prayer, of fasting, of worship, of trade, of marriage. Like there's a lot of aspects of Islamic law. As Muslims, we conduct ourselves in a certain way. We have, a legal code that are both private, that are both worship oriented, and that are public as well. And so these schools of law are very important, right? There's different elements of Islam. One of them is belief, right? So we have schools of belief and theology and thought, but then there's schools of practice. Islam is not just orthodoxy, it's orthopraxy. Like, how do we practice properly? And so the Islamic law focuses on that. And so a person who is an expert or a specialist or a scholar in the science of fiqh is a faqih. So this word fiqh means deep understanding, like linguistically it means deep understanding, but it has come to mean law in general. And so someone who basically is trained in one of the schools of Islamic law, there are a couple of them. They're basically great scholars who came up with methodologies of approaching law. That's probably a conversation for another day. But basically, anyone who's trained in a school of Islamic law is known as a faqih. I guess one way to put it is, when it comes to like constitutional scholars, there are different approaches, right? There's like the originalists who want to interpret the scholar in the original way the interpreters kind of meant it, or the founding fathers meant it, and then there are revisionists who want to think that the Constitution is a more dynamic document that should adapt to the changing times, or we should interpret it in the modern context. So there are different schools and approaches to that. So similarly, in the Muslim world, there are slight differences in the schools of law, but basically anyone who studies law, right, is considered a faqih. Another English equivalent of it would be a jurist. This is not a common title. So you usually don't call someone faqih and then give their name, but this is a role or a scholar of the specific discipline, if that makes sense. A more common title that you'll find used is the word mufti. So this word mufti is not just a jurist, is not just a scholar of law, but it's someone who specifically is a legal expert and a counselor or an advisor. And they can issue what's called a fatwa, which is technically it's an authoritative, non-binding legal verdict. I think that's what I have here. What that means is this. They're not binding in the sense that a mufti is not a state representative. They're not a judge, right? So when they're issuing a ruling, they're not saying that someone has to follow it, if that makes sense, right? They're not coming with state authority, but what they're saying is this is an opinion that one should. So basically what happens is maybe the ruler would approach the mufti, or an individual congregant, or a person who has a question or is going through a crisis approaches the mufti and is seeking advice, a legal opinion. They say the ruling for this situation is usually this, right? The ruling of someone who, let me give a good example of this. I should have one off the top of my head. But basically, there's general rulings for people. Oh, I'll give an example, right? Fasting during Ramadan, right? During the 30 days of Ramadan, people have to fast, right? That's the general ruling. You go to someone, they'll give you that ruling. But someone can come to this mufti and say, I'm going through this situation. I am pregnant and I'm going through these issues and I have to take this medication and so on and so forth. What should I do in this specific situation? And so the mufti is able to, because they're an expert in the law, they can look at their specific situation and give basically an alternative opinion from the general consensus opinion on what should be done. That's a very primitive example. There are much more complex examples, but basically a mufti is someone who gives legal advice to people. It's not binding though, because it's not coming from the authority of a state structure. It's not like a judge giving a ruling, but it's basically people will come to muftis asking them for legal advice, if that makes sense. Sorry if that was a bit long-winded. So these are the two main terms used when it comes to like Islamic law. The other term that's very less common, but is an important term, is this term mujtahid. And this is someone who is an authoritative scholar. What this means is they are very, very advanced in their study of Islamic law, to the point where most fuqaha, most faqihs, most legal scholars, they follow an Islamic school of thought. I mentioned a couple of them. I personally, for example, follow a school of thought. I've studied it, right? I'm not a mufti. I haven't studied to the point where I can give legal opinions that are different from whatever. But if someone asks me what's the ruling of, this or that, I can probably give the general opinion. But a mujtahid is someone who doesn't even have to follow a school of law. They can actually go back directly to the sources, the Quran and the Hadith of the Prophet, and come up with an opinion that goes away from the precedent of all of the other schools or scholars from before, if that makes sense. So it's a very high level. And the reality is most mujtahids, even the few people in the world who might be at this level, they still follow a school of law out of respect and out of inheritance and recognizing that these are schools, right? There are thousands of scholars that went under these schools. For them to come up with independent opinion is not something that they would do necessarily. But, there are some very specific issues that come up in the modern day, right? Issues around bioethics. We can talk about genetics and bioethics and different fields and arenas where you do need some scholars who can come up with, what should the ruling be on organ donation, right? That's not something that they thought about before, right? Because it wasn't very easy to donate an organ, but now that's a possibility. So they'll be able to look at very specific issues and be able to come up with that. That makes sense. The founders of these schools who were also mujtahids, they were at that level, if that makes sense. All right. So now we'll go to a different category, and I'll quickly go through these because they're not as important. These are legal administrators. These are people who are given authority by the state, right, by the government to play a specific role. So one of them, and it's the equivalent in a non-Muslim context, in a Western context, is the word qadi, which just means judge. So someone who's a qadi is a judge. They play a certain role. They're like a magistrate, so kind of a civil judge, if that makes sense. They basically, people will come to them. For example, a woman wants to get a divorce. They can go to the qadi and ask them, like, my husband is mistreating me or this and that. Can I get a divorce? They can do that. The difference between a mufti and a qadi is that a mufti gives advice, but it's not binding. A qadi, once they make the ruling, that ruling would be binding. So the person would have to follow. Two people having a contract dispute about a trade, they would go to the qadi, and the qadi would rule that, this person's in the wrong, this person's in the right, and so on and so forth, if that makes sense. Another term that's not very common, but it exists, is Qadi al-Qudat. This is the justice of justices. So this is kind of like the supreme justice or chief justice, right? This is the person in charge of the whole judicial system in a polity or in a country or in a state, if that makes sense. So this would be like the equivalent of a Supreme Court justice, if that makes sense. So that's a term. Another term that historically was an interesting one, and now I guess it's morphed in the modern world, is this role of muhtasib. So muhtasib is the inspector. They're the person in the marketplace that goes around and makes sure that regulations are being followed, that people aren't being taxed unjustly, that there are ethics around the marketplace, right? So back then there was actually a marketplace. They would go there. Obviously today it would morph in the form of there's e-commerce and there's different forms of trade, but basically the inspector, almost kind of like a police officer. It's kind of in between a police officer and kind of a public official that goes and makes sure that the weights are being balanced properly. So the word hisab actually means weights, right? So back then people would figure out through weights how much something costs, and so the muhtasib was someone who kind of enforces that. So it's kind of a interesting role that existed in the past, if that makes sense. Very quickly, I'm going to go through these roles of political authority. These aren't scholarly titles so much. They're more political roles, but I think it's good to just know these terms. I'll quickly go through them. The first one is the word hakim. And this word actually comes up multiple times in different contexts. So we'll come back to this word. But a hakim is an executive, right? It's a governor, it's a ruler, maybe the leader of the community, the leader of the Muslim state has different provinces. And so he assigns an executive, someone who basically makes executive judgment. So he's not a judicial role, he's not a judge, he's not a qadi, but he's a hakim. He basically makes, executive rulings. The word that's more commonly used for the leader of a country or a nation or a state is the word sultan. So sultan is a political ruler. It could be a monarch. It could be a king. This is a less religious term. It's basically, there were religious terms that were used early on, but at some point, in Islamic history, you realize that a lot of these rulers are just rulers. They have a strong military, they had charisma, they had power, they took authority. So they didn't play any religious function necessarily, but they took power, and the word that they would be used is sultan, if that makes sense. Continuing on, these two terms are a little more important. And they play a theological context as well, is the word caliph in English, or khalifa. And this is a word that's, you'll hear in the Western context as well. The word khalifa literally means a successor or a representative, a custodian. And the idea in the Quran, God tells us that Muslims are custodians of God on earth, that we're here on earth as his custodians, that we're supposed to be caretakers of the earth, right? And that's a call to environmental responsibility. It's a call to justice, and so on and so forth. And so this idea of Khalifa is someone who is a representative of God on earth, Khalifatullah, Caliph of God, or Khalifatul Rasulullah, so the Caliph of the Messenger of God. And so specifically people who are the kind of, not descendants, but the successors of the Prophet, peace be upon him. For Sunnis, that was Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali. These were like the rightly guided caliphs. These were the rulers of the Muslim community after the Prophet, peace be upon him, passed away. And so they were basically his successors. And the word that was used was Khalifa. And they were the leader of the Muslim community, right? The entire Muslim world at the time. Obviously, it became fragmented later. And so you don't necessarily have one Khalifa that represents everyone. At times you have competing caliphates. But at the time, right after the Prophet, there was a clear line of succession, at least according to Sunnis. Another term that was used in an equivalent context was Amir al-Mu'minin. So Amir means commander or prince, right? And then Mu'minin means faithful. So the commander or the leader of the faithful, basically the leader of the Muslim community. These terms were fairly used interchangeably. The first caliph, Abu Bakr, didn't use the word Amir al-Mu'minin. The second one, Umar, use this term rather than caliph at times. So these are all political terms. Some of them come up, but I just wanted to include them for inclusion's sake, if that makes sense. The next subject we'll look at is a really important one. Obviously, the foundation for Islamic, thought and learning is the Quran, which we believe is the revelation from God. So these are all terms that refer to people who have a relationship with the Quran or scholars of the Quran. The first one, not necessarily scholar, but they could be, is the word hafid. So hafid comes from the word hifth, which means to protect or guard. And so technically this would mean guardian. But what is it that they're guarding? So a hafid is someone who memorizes the entire Quran by heart. And so there are many people in our community, millions of Muslims who've committed the entire Quran to heart, right, from cover to cover. They're referred to as hafid. The female equivalent is hafida. So these are people who basically memorize the Quran. They don't have to be scholars, right? Someone can memorize the Quran without really understanding it deeply, but obviously someone who's memorized the Quran, their path to understanding the Quran is much, much facilitated as well. Another term that's used is qari. Qari means someone who's a reciter of the Quran. So someone could be a qari and not have memorized the whole Quran, right? They might just be very good at reciting the Quran or portions of the Quran, but oftentimes most qura, qaris, the people, the plural, are people who've memorized the whole Quran. But the qari has a leg up in that, one, they are trained in the rules of recitation. So there are very specific rules of how to pronounce the letters, the words, elocution, recitation, and doing it beautifully. And so the qari is someone who knows those rules. The second thing is there's actually multiple chains of, or let's say modes of recitation. So in Arabia, there were different dialects. And so the Quran is actually very unique in that we have the preserved dialects that were there. There are a couple of them. And so a qari might be someone who studied all of that. And it's a massive amount of information, right? If the Quran is about 600 pages, but imagine there are multiple ways to recite those 600 pages. A master qari is someone who maybe has studied that and has committed all of that to memory and can recite it beautifully. They often lead prayers and so on, if that makes sense. The next term and the last term when it comes to the Quranic sciences is not someone who's necessarily memorized the Quran or reciting the Quran, or although they could do both of those, but it's someone who really studies and teaches the Quran. So a mufassir is someone who basically writes or teaches commentary of the Quran, right? They've studied the meanings of the Quran. They've read many books on what the different verses of the Quran mean. So this word exegesis, right, tafsir is where the word mufassir comes from. So this is someone who's truly a scholar of the Quran, if that makes sense. So those are the Quranic terms that we'll look at. The next subject we'll look at is almost equally important, and it's the science of hadith. So the Quran is the revelation from God that we believe as Muslims. The hadith are the narrations of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the traditions, the things that he practiced, the writings that people have of him. And this is a very, very unique science because it's not just what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, but we're actually very particular about how it comes down to us to make sure it's authentically from him, right? Anyone can claim anything about anyone saying anything, right, in history, but we're very particular about making sure that, that we believe the Prophet, peace be upon him, said this. And we know this because this person narrated from this person who narrated from this person who narrated from this person. And here's the biographies of all these people. This is when they lived. This is where they lived. This is how they were respected in the community or whatever, right? So it's the chain of narration, the chain of transmission. So it's not just the text, but it's the chain. And so a muhaddith is someone who specializes in that study of hadith, right? The sayings of the Prophet. And there are multiple collections of this. My grandfather, who was a scholar, he was specifically a muhaddith. So he was someone who really specialized in this science, in this subject. And a higher level of this is Sheikh al-Hadith. So you'll hear the word Sheikh again. But here it specifically means a senior teacher of Hadith. So a lot of times there's a seminary or a madrasa, and the person who's in charge of the department of Hadith would be called Sheikh al-Hadith. So this is really the basic term that one should be familiar with, muhaddith, when it comes to hadith. But there's actually some interesting terms. There are three terms that are almost different tiers, and these are very impressive. So the first one is the first level of a hadith scholar is someone, or sorry, not first level. A muhaddith is a hadith scholar, but a really advanced hadith scholar will be called a hafid. Now, this is the same word as someone who's memorized the Quran, but in this context, it's someone who's memorized hadith and a massive amount of hadith. So here, it's specifically someone who's memorized over 100,000 hadith, right? With the text of the hadith, right? The statement of the Prophet, in addition to the chain of narrators. So sometimes you'll have one hadith, but it has multiple chains, right? Multiple different groups of people narrated that hadith back to the Prophet. And so this is like just the 100,000 is incredible. It's hard to fathom. A higher level above this, and I have a mistake here, is actually what's called a hujjah. So hujjah means proof or an authority, someone who's really an authority in the science of hadith. This is someone who's memorized over 300,000 hadith. So this is, I mean, this is something in the modern world. It's so rare that people do this, right? In our age of not being able to focus, right? But for people to sit down and memorize so much and keep so much to memory is a really impressive feat. And so it's very rare that we see this, but there are documented people in the past who are at this level. And the greatest highest level is this word hakim, which you'll find it's actually the same word that you'll find for a political ruler, right? So it gets confusing sometimes, but specifically in the science of hadith, it's a master of hadith who pretty much has memorized all of the hadith that you can find of the Prophet. They've committed them to memory. It's probably hundreds of thousands of hadith altogether. So this is a very, very advanced level. That makes sense. We just have a few more categories we'll look at. The next science or subject is the science of spirituality. And this is a very unique one because it's not very much a book knowledge focused science. And there is an aspect of that. But this is the science of spirituality, or what in the Muslim world is called Sufism. And so there's entire literature, there's an entire tradition of spiritual excellence, right? Where people aren't just trying to be Muslim, they're trying to really excel in their worship of God and their connection to God, their closeness to God. And so there's a whole tradition of, a spiritual path that people can follow. And there's this idea that there are people who inherited the knowledge from the Prophet that was spiritual in nature, and that was passed down from generation to generation. And the master taught the disciple to a point where they had traveled the path, and it's a very mystical kind of dimension to Islam. And so here you'll find different terms for what's a spiritual guide, someone who's basically gone down that path. And this is a very unique one because you'll find different words, right? Sheikh is a common term. It's used in other contexts, but it's also used to mean a spiritual guide. Another Arabic word is murshid, which means guide. In Persian or in the South Asian Indian Urdu context, you'll find the word pir. And then you'll find a Turkish Persian word, hoja or khwaja. These are the same word, but one is Persian and one is Turkish. And all of these basically mean a spiritual guide. They basically are qualified, they have permission, they've gone down a spiritual path and gotten to a certain point, and they can take on disciples to basically take them on the path, if that makes sense. And then, so that's the master, the guide. The disciple would be called a murid. It's an Arabic word, or salik. A common one in the West that people know is dervish, darwish, right? Dervish. The whirling dervishes is one type of dervish, right? Another word is faqir. Faqir literally means a poor person, right? But here it kind of means someone who recognizes their poverty to God and wants to kind of devote their life to God, right? And so this is someone who's initiated on a spiritual path, is trying to achieve greater heights, and generally is taking the hand of a guide to kind of take them on that path, if that makes sense. There's a lot of terminology in the spiritual sciences that we can get into. I don't want to get into too much, but the last one that is commonly used is what's called a muqaddam or a khalifa. This is not the caliph in that context, but in the spiritual context, or a naib. And this is a person who, you have the spiritual guide. He might have advanced students that he's given permission to help lead. So, for example, I know of, for example, a Sufi sheikh in Morocco. He has representatives in Algeria, in basically Algeria and France and Italy and America. These are his muqaddams. They basically function as the spiritual guide for the people of that region, if that makes sense. But they kind of report to him, and they basically are disciples of him. So this is a specific science. We could spend a lot of time on it, but these are some terms that are used in the science of spirituality. We'll just get through a few more. I know there's a lot of terms. I hope this is not overwhelming. In the field of theology, you have a theologian, a mutakallim. This is someone who specializes in kind of speculative theology. So this is not just creedal theology of just we believe in this, we believe in this, we believe in this. These are people who use logic to defend articles of faith. So, for example, Muslims believe in one God. Now they use rational proofs to why belief in one God makes sense, why belief in multiple gods doesn't make sense, and so on and so forth. So it's a little more of a philosophical, theological tradition. A Faylasuf is the equivalent of philosopher. So these are Muslims who studied Greek philosophy and kind of mastered it, and it's literally the equivalent word of a philosopher, Faylasuf. And then you'll find this word hakim, very similar to some other words that you'll find. This is someone it's actually interesting. A lot of philosophers of the past, they studied what they called the natural sciences and the rational sciences. So natural sciences would be things like science, right? Today, what we think of astronomy, they would study medicine, they would study basically science. And then the rational sciences would be things like logic, things like philosophy. And so these are people who kind of merge both of those fields together, if that makes sense. So these are the terms usually used in theology, philosophy. Um, this is less common, but you have medicine as well. There are practitioners of medicine who often tend to be scholars. So there's another word, hakim, you'll find the same word here. But hakim is someone who practices traditional medicine. So not necessarily a physician in a medical surgical context, but someone who practices alternative or traditional medicine. There's an aspect or tradition of prophetic medicine. This would include things like cupping, things like herbal remedies, and so on and so forth. And that the tabib is someone who's actually a physician. So like a physician who treats people as a doctor, if that makes sense. So those were all the different sciences or subjects. There are a couple of really high honorific titles, and I'm just wrapping up. I'll be done in a minute or two, inshallah. The high honorific titles are titles used for very special individuals. Now, Imam is one of them. And that's funny because Imam is just a prayer leader, right? But sometimes you'll refer to certain people as Imams who founded schools or made tremendous contributions to scholarship. And so there are some Imams, Imam al-Ghazali or Imam Abu Hanifa, that people that are familiar with. So Imam can be a very high title as well. Another word that's used is Allama. So alim is scholar, right? It's the word for scholar. Allama is an intensive form. So it's someone who's a very eminent or erudite scholar. And it's used for certain individuals. For example, there's someone named Allama Iqbal, who was a very well-known poet and philosopher from India. So he's very well-known and he's given that title. Another word that's used is Sheikh al-Islam. Sheikh is a common word, but Sheikh al-Islam is someone who's basically is kind of a really well-known scholar of a certain era or a certain generation, and there are certain people that are given this title. Another one is Sultan al-Ulama. Sultan is king or sovereign or ruler, but the king or the prince of the scholars, right? So someone who really excelled amongst the scholars and was recognized by other scholars. Another term that's used is Hujjatul Islam, which is a proof of Islam. This is someone who did a tremendous role in defending the faith from maybe heresy or something like that. Usually it's referred to as a specific scholar, Imam al-Ghazali, who's a very famous scholar of Islam. He's given this title. And lastly, one really important title is this title, Mujaddid. And this comes from a hadith of the Prophet where he said, basically every 100 years, every century, there will be someone who comes and is born into the world who basically revives the religion, right? The religion can become decadent or stale or things happen, right? And they basically revive and renew the religion, the spirit of the religion. And throughout many centuries, if you study history, you can find certain individuals in Islamic tradition that basically played that role that you can tell was very eminent of that time. And so that's kind of the idea of a mujaddid. It's based on this tradition of the Prophet. Some titles that are for descendants of the Prophet. These are titles who are, the direct descendants of the Prophet, peace be upon him, through his grandsons, Hassan or Hussein. So one common term is Sayyid, which means Lord or Master. It's just an honorific title. So people who are descendants of the Prophet will say this. In the Shia tradition, it's interesting. There are Sunni Sayyids and there are Shia Sayyids. But the Shia Sayyids, they wear black turbans. And so if you see an Iranian cleric, scholar, they wear a black turban, that means they're a descendant of the Prophet. The non-descendants, they would wear a white turban. Another word that's common more in North Africa, in Egypt and Morocco is the word Sharif. It also means a descendant of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The female equivalent is Sharifa. And then in Yemen specifically, they use the word Habib, which just means beloved. But again, these are descendants of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And the Yemeni traders, they spread Islam throughout Indonesia, Malaysia, the Southeast Asian islands. And so they use the word as well. And in India, in South Asia, you'll find this word Mir, which also is a descendant of the Prophet, if that makes sense. Lastly, I don't want to leave them out. I'm not an expert in this tradition. I did consult a friend of mine who is Shia. But there are certain terms that are used in the Shia tradition, and they're a little more clerical. They have like a top-down kind of, they'll assign these terms, and so it's not as common in the Sunni world. But they have these words, Ayatollah. It's very common. People have heard it in the West, right? Ayatollah means sign of God, and it literally means that, but it's a senior Shia scholar. There's maybe a few hundred in the world. These are really, really high-level scholars. And then the highest scholars are called Ayatollah al-Udma, or another word is Marja. These are basically, there's maybe a handful of them, 20, 30, 50 of them in the world. These people, they become reference points that anyone who has questions, they basically go to these individuals and they're kind of decisive or authoritative. And so Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. These people were considered marjas or grand ayatollahs, if that makes sense. And then when it comes to seminary students, they have what's called Hujjatul Islam. So that's below an ayatollah, and Thiqatul Islam. These are basically, they mean trust of Islam, proof of Islam, but they're basically entry-level titles or mid-level clerics, right? The people who play roles, but they're not at that level of ayatollah. They also use the word sheikh. But here, when they use the word sheikh, if it's a scholar that's a descendant of the Prophet, they use the word Sayyid, who has black turban. Sheikh will wear a white turban, is not a descendant of the Prophet, but obviously someone who's scholarly. Lastly, it's important for the Shia, they use the word imam as well. They use it in the same way most Sunnis use it, prayer leader, congregational prayer leader, nothing special. But they also use it in a political context for their supreme leader, right? So in the country of Iran specifically, you have Khamenei, they were ayatollahs, they were also imams. They're the supreme leader, supreme political leader. You'll hear this term in the West. Lastly, they have a theological understanding of this term as well that Sunnis do not have. And basically, there's different types of Shia. There's what are called Twelvers, there's Ismailis, there's Zaydis, there's subsets. I don't have time to get into the history. The Twelvers, they believe that there were these imams that were divinely appointed descendants of the Prophet, and they were infallible. They were incapable of making mistakes. And so they basically believe in, they call them imams. The Ismailis are interesting. So the Twelvers, they believe there were only 12 of them, and then the last one was occulted and will return one day. But the Ismailis believe there's a continuous line of them. And so there is someone today, the Aga Khan, who is considered the living imam for the Ismailis. And so these are descendants of the Prophet, again, considered infallible. And then there's a group of Shia, they're called Zaydis. They live in Yemen and a few other places. They actually reject this idea of infallibly divinely appointed imams, but they do believe that the ruler of the Muslims should be a descendant of the Prophet. So they're more similar to Sunnis. I don't have time to get into all the theological differences, but they'll use the word imam, right? All the Shia will use the word imam in different contexts from how Sunnis will refer to imams. We don't believe in divinely appointed successors to the Prophet, if that makes sense. So that, I know that was a lot of terms. I don't even know how many terms that was, but I hope that was beneficial. I'm happy to answer questions. Bismillah. Go ahead.
If I may ask a question, couple.
Of course.
Yes. I noticed only once in the entire list of titles and responsibilities the use of the term fatwa, and that was in connection with one person who was authorized to issue a fatwa.
Right.
Are there others that issue fatwas, and what is the effect really of a fatwa? Because the way you presented it, it seemed like it did not have the kind of general applicability and enforceability and almost pejorative kind of term that we sometimes hear it referred to.
Sure. I think the word fatwa became so common in the West because of a specific fatwa that was given by Ayatollah Khomeini calling for the death of someone who had, basically committed heresy or slandered the Prophet, peace be upon him. So there's a very specific context to that. But really, fatwa is pretty not mundane, but it's really, someone has a question, right? They're going through a family situation and they want to consult a scholar about a legal matter. Should I do this? Should I do that? Is this okay? Is it not okay? And the mufti will give a fatwa. And you can actually go to multiple muftis and they might give multiple fatwas. One might say that you should do this. One might say you should do that. It's not good to do what's called fatwa shopping. So a lot of Muslims just want to follow their own desire and they'll shop around. But the idea is that you basically are seeking advice from a scholar rather than coming up with something on your own, right? And so it doesn't have that legal weight. Like if a justice or a judge gives a ruling, right, you have to do that, right? This is what's going to happen. A fatwa is, for example, I'll give an example, right? Two people get into a disagreement about a trade dispute, right? So they could go to the qadi and get a ruling that's authoritative. Or they could just go, they don't want to hurt their brother, right? They don't want to do injustice. They can go to a scholar and say, am I in the wrong here? Should I do this? Should I do that? And just basically get advice, right? If that makes sense. So it's not binding, but it is considered authoritative in the sense that the Muslim tradition says that a mufti, right, they're trying to figure out the ruling that God would want or the Prophet would want in a situation. If they're correct in that ruling, they get 2 times the reward. And if they're incorrect, they still get a reward because they sincerely applied their efforts in trying to understand what God and his messenger would have wanted in that situation. So hopefully that kind of answers it.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much. A second question is, I'm working on a journal article for an academic journal, and refer to the Prophet Muhammad on occasion. Is it appropriate in Western sort of theological discourse, or inappropriate for a person not to include the phrase peace be upon him? Is it inappropriate to not refer to him as the Prophet Muhammad, but to merely refer to him as Muhammad? What is the most sensitive way for a non-Muslim in academic jargon to refer to the Prophet Muhammad?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, from us as Muslims, we generally sometimes don't even say his name out of respect for him. Sometimes we'll say his name because we love to say his name. We'll say prophet, we'll say peace be upon him. And a lot of times, you know, we'll read texts, right, academic texts that don't mention that, and we'll just insert that ourselves. So I don't think it's particularly offensive. Like, I think there are conventions in academia where people will not refer to peace be upon him. You know, that's not something that you generally say. And so it's okay to not say that. As a Muslim reading it, I would just include that myself. So I don't think that there's something wrong with that. But if possible, I think, you know, any Muslim would be happy of the inclusion of the word prophet or peace be upon him or anything of the sort. So I would be generally advised to follow academic convention, you know, what other texts are doing. I know often in devotional texts it's used, and not in devotional texts it's not used. Muslims will generally across the board use it, but if it's inappropriate or not appropriate in an academic setting, PhD thesis or in a monograph, they probably won't use it. So I don't want to say for certain, but I think nobody would be particularly offended if it's not included. I think they'd understand why it's not included if it's not common to include it.
Thank you.
Of course.
Well, thank you so very much, Ustad Musad. This has been quite illuminating. I think my big takeaway is your presentation should be delivered to every single Western media journalist so that we can get the proper terms be out there, and we can all be more educated. Because I learned a tremendous amount tonight, and I'm going to be able to carry that forward. So it's been exceptionally valuable. And I hope that all of our audience members feel the same way, because I feel like this was quite illuminating. And we really thank you for putting together the presentation, and then also being with us this evening, because it's been just wonderful. So I want to thank all of our guests, of course, for making space in their busy schedules, and point out that in the chat I did put our next Ilm Circle registration link. It would be Tuesday, September 22nd. And it is celebrating the annual Torah cycle. And Rabbi Michael Wasserman will be with us that evening. So I thank all of you for your attention tonight. And I hope that you feel that it has been as beneficial as what I feel. Of course, I have to thank our producer, Asra Hussein, who is suffering with a little bit of a headache tonight. So we wish her well. And then, of course, Joe, who's in the background, and he makes us all look really, really good. So thank you both so much for putting this wonderful program together each and every month. And so have a wonderful evening and stay cool for the next few days.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful and a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.